There's so many acai products on the market now, from frozen pulp and smoothie packs to freeze-dried powder and supplements. How is it eaten traditionally? Amazonian tribes cut down the tree, eat its heart, and then pee on the stump to attract a certain type of beetle that lays these monster maggots, and so a few weeks later you've got 3 or 4 pounds of these suckers, so you can make some grub kebabs. I think I'll just stick with my smoothie pack. Despite being used for a long time as food in the Amazon, only since the beginning of this century have acai berries been the object of scientific research. 4 years ago I reviewed that research, starting with in vitro studies that showed that acai could kill leukemia cells in a petri dish at levels one might expect in one's bloodstream eating a cup or two of acai pulp, or cutting the growth of colon cancer cells in half. Unfortunately, subsequent studies published since then failed to find such benefit for that type of colon cancer, a different type of colon cancer, or an estrogen receptor negative form of breast cancer. An acai extract did appear to kill off a line of estrogen receptor positive breast cancer cells, but to achieve that level of acai nutrients in your breast, you'd have to sit down to like 400 cups of acai pulp. That's the problem with many of these petri dish studies. They use concentrations that you could never realistically achieve in your bloodstream. For example, acai berries may exert a neuroprotective effect, blocking the buildup of amyloid fibers implicated in Alzheimer's, but only at a dose reached, drinking maybe 2,000 cups at a time. Or have an anti-allergy effect, or decrease bone loss at a mere 1,000 cups a day. But I also talked about a clinical study in which folks were asked to drink less than a cup a day of acai in a smoothie, and appeared to get significant improvements in blood sugar and insulin levels and cholesterol. Now, there was no control group, and it was a small study, but there'd never been a bigger study to try to replicate it until now. Same amount of acai for the same duration, but no significant improvements in blood sugars, insulin, or cholesterol. Why did this study fail to show the benefits seen in the first study? Well, this study was publicly funded, no conflicts of interest, whereas the first study was funded by an acai company, which always makes you suspect that maybe the study was somehow designed to get the desired result. And indeed, the study participants were not just given acai smoothies, but explicitly told to avoid processed meat, like bacon and hot dogs. No wonder their numbers looked better at the end of the month. Now, the new study did find a decrease in markers of oxidative stress in the participants' bloodstream, a sign of how antioxidant-rich acai berries can be. Those that hawk supplements love to talk about how acai consumption can triple antioxidant capacity. Triple the antioxidant capacity of your blood. And if you look at the study they cite, yes, there was a tripling in antioxidant capacity of the blood after eating acai, but there was the same or even better tripling after just plain applesauce, which was used as a control and is significantly cheaper than acai berries or supplements. There was a new study showing significant improvements in artery function after eating acai berries, but any more than commoner fruits and vegetables? Plant-based diets have been found to reduce the risk of some of our leading causes of death and disability. Studies have shown that the longest-living and least dementia-prone populations subsist on plant-based diets. So why focus on just this one plant for brain health and performance, acai berries? Well, foods rich in polyphenols appear to improve brain health, and acai berries have lots of polyphenols and antioxidants, so maybe they'd help. But if you're just looking at polyphenols, there are over a dozen foods that have more per serving, and it doesn't have to be black elderberry. Regular fruits like plums have more. A few spoonfuls of flax seeds, a few squares of dark chocolate, or even just a cup of coffee has more. In terms of antioxidants, yes, acai berries may have 10 times more antioxidant content than more typical fruits like peaches and papayas, 5 times more than strawberries, but comparable to blackberries. In fact, blackberries appear to have even more antioxidants and are cheaper and more widely available. But acai berries don't just have potential brain benefits. For example, protecting the lungs against harm induced by cigarette smoke. But you all remember that study, right? That's the one where addition of acai berries to cigarettes has a protective effect against emphysema in smoking mice. That's not very helpful. There's this long list of impressive-looking benefits until you dig a little deeper. For example, I was excited to see reduction of coronary disease risk due to a vasodilation effect, but less excited when I pulled the study and found out that they were talking about a vasodilator effect in the mesenteric vascular bed of the rat. But there hadn't been any studies on acai berries and artery function in humans until now. Give some overweight men a smoothie containing about 2/3 of a cup of frozen acai pulp and a half a banana, versus an artificially colored placebo smoothie with the banana but no acai. You get a significant improvement in artery function within 2 hours of consumption, which lasts at least for 6 hours. That 1 or 2 point bump is clinically significant. Those walking around with just a point higher go on to have 13% fewer cardiovascular events, like fatal heart attacks. You can get the same effect from wild blueberries, though, about a 1.5 point bump 2 hours after wild blueberry consumption, in effect peaking and plateauing at about 1.5 cups of blueberries, with 2.5 or 3.5 cups showing no further benefits. What about cooked blueberries? Here's the same wild blueberry drink effect we saw before, but what if you baked the blueberries into a bun like a blueberry muffin? Same dramatic improvement in artery function. Cocoa can do it too. 1 tablespoon of cocoa gets you about 1 point, and 2 tablespoons is like a whopping 4 points. That's like double the berries. 1.25 cups worth of multicolored grapes give a nice boost in artery function, but enough to counter an acute endothelial insult, a sudden attack on the vulnerable inner layer of our arteries. They decided on a sausage and egg McMuffin meal. They weren't messing around. Without the grapes, that meant cutting artery function nearly in half within an hour, and the artery stayed stiffened and crippled 3 hours later. But eat that McMuffin with all those grapes, and hardly any effect. Eat a meal with hamburger meat, and artery function drops after the meal, but eat that same meal with some spices, including 1.5 teaspoons of turmeric, and your artery function gets better. What about orange juice? 4 cups a day for 4 weeks, and no change in artery function. But that was commercial orange juice from concentrate. What about freshly squeezed orange juice? Here's the before, and here's the after. Still nothing. That's one of the reasons berries are the healthiest fruits. Want a beverage that can improve your artery function? Green tea. 2 cups of green tea, and you get that same cocoa effect, nearly 4 points within just 30 minutes. And that same crazy effect you get with green tea, you get with black tea. Twice as powerful an effect as the acai berries. So why focus on just that one plant? Well, the real reason, presumably, is that the author owns a patent on an acai-based dietary supplement. Dietary practices influence our exposure to pesticides, toxic heavy metals, and industrial pollutants. A diet high in fish and other animal products, for example, results in greater exposure to these pollutants than does a more plant-based diet, because these compounds may accumulate up the food chain. Researchers at UC Davis analyzed the diets of children and adults in California to see just how bad things have gotten. Cancer benchmark levels were exceeded by all children. 100% of children tested for arsenic, the banned pesticides dieldrin and DDT, metabolite DDE, as well as dioxins, and not just by a little. More than 100 times the acceptable daily exposure for arsenic in preschoolers, school-aged children, parents, and older adults, about 10 times the acceptable levels for these various pesticides, and up to 1,000 times the daily dose for dioxins. Where are all these toxins coming from? The number one source of dioxins in the diets of Californian preschoolers, kids, parents, and grandparents appears to be dairy, followed by meat, then white potatoes, refined grains, mushrooms, poultry, fish. Our DDT legacy these days is also mostly from dairy. Dieldrin was created as a safer alternative to DDT, but was banned 2 years later, in 1974, though still found in our bodies, mostly thanks to dairy, meat, and evidently cucumbers. Chlordane made it into the 80s before being banned, though we're still exposed through dairy and cukes. Lead is also food-wise, mostly from dairy, and mercury, not surprisingly, mostly from tuna and other seafood. But arsenic was surprising, mostly from chicken in children. Why? Let me tell you a tale of arsenic in chicken. Arsenic is well known as a poison by anyone who reads mysteries or the history of the Borgias. With its long and colorful history, arsenic is not something that people want in their food. So when a biostats student went to the USDA 17 years ago in search of a project for his master's degree, he decided to look into it. And what he found was this startling difference. Arsenic levels in chicken were like 3 times that of other meats. His veterinary colleagues were like, duh, though. I mean, don't you know we feed 4 different types of arsenic-containing antibiotic drugs to poultry since, like 1944? So while arsenic-based drugs have been fed to poultry since the 40s, recognition of this source of exposure for humans only occurred after this student churned through the data. It was published in 2004, expanded upon in 2006. The National Chicken Council was none too pleased, saying lots of foods are contaminated with arsenic. By focusing specifically on chicken, the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy makes it clear that their true objective is to force chicken producers to stop using these safe and effective products, by which they mean these arsenic-containing drugs, which they admit to using, but say, don't worry, they use organic arsenic, not the inorganic form made infamous in Arsenic and Old Lace. That is, apparently, until you cook it. When you cook chicken, it appears some of the arsenic drug in the meat turns into the Arsenic and Old Lace variety. And so, the Poison-Free Poultry Act of 2009 was introduced into Congress. You can tell how well that did based on the subsequent introduction of the Poison-Free Poultry Act of 2011. Twist, they said, poison poor poultry, pish posh. And so in 2013, a coalition of 9 groups got together and sued the FDA. And by December 31st, 2015, all arsenic-containing poultry drugs were withdrawn. And so as of 2016, arsenic will no longer be fed to chickens. The bad news is that without the arsenic-containing drug roxarsone, chicken may lose some of its appealing pink color. In the end, the poultry industry only got away with exposing the American public to arsenic for 72 years. It should be noted that the European Union had never approved such drugs in the first place, saying, feed our animals arsenic? No thanks. Nein danke. No grazie. No merci. Europe also long since banned the urgent threat to human health posed by feeding farm animals millions of pounds of human antibiotics, a problem that gets worse every year instead of better, feeding chickens en masse literally tons of drugs like tetracyclines and penicillins to fatten them faster, dating back to 1951, where drug companies whipped out the all caps to promise big profits. A dangerous practice the poultry industry had gotten away with for 66 years and counting. When arsenic-containing drugs are fed to chickens, not only does it grow out into their feathers, which can then be fed back to them as a slaughterhouse byproduct, the arsenic can get into their tissues and then into our tissues, explaining why national studies found that those who eat more poultry have tended to have more arsenic flowing through their bodies. Why would the industry do that? In modern poultry CAFOs, these concentrated animal feeding operations, there can be 200,000 birds under one roof, and so the floors of these buildings become covered with feces. While this so-called factory farming decreases cost, this also increases the risk of disease. That's where arsenic-containing drugs and other antibiotic feed additives can come in to try to cut down the spread of disease in such an unnatural environment, to which you can imagine smug vegetarians gloating how glad they are they don't eat chicken. But what do you think happens to the poop? The arsenic from the drugs in the feed can get into our crops, into the air, and into the groundwater, and find its way into our bodies, whether we eat meat or not. Yeah, but how much arsenic are we really talking about? Well, we raise billions of chickens every year, and if historically the vast majority were fed arsenic, then if you do the math, we're talking about dumping 500,000 pounds worth of pure arsenic into the environment every year, much of it onto our crops, or shoveled directly into the mouths of other farm animals. Most of the arsenic in chicken waste is water-soluble, so there are certainly concerns about it seeping into the groundwater. But if it's used as a fertilizer, what about our food? Studies on the levels of arsenic in the U.S. food supply dating back to the 70s identified two foods, fish aside, with the highest levels, chicken and rice, both of which can accumulate arsenic in the same way. Deliver an arsenic-containing drug like roxarsone to chickens, and it ends up in their manure, which ends up in the soil, which ends up in our pilaf. Rice is now the primary source of arsenic exposure in a non-seafood diet. I was surprised to see mushrooms in the top 5 food sources of arsenic, but then not so surprised when I found out that poultry litter was commonly used as a starting material to grow mushrooms in the United States. And over the years, mushroom arsenic content has rivaled the arsenic concentration in rice, though people tend to eat more rice than mushrooms on a daily basis. And arsenic levels in mushrooms did seem to be dipping starting about a decade ago, confirmed in this latest 2016 paper that looked at a dozen different types of mushrooms, plain white button mushrooms, cremini, portobello, shiitake, trumpet, oyster, nameko, never heard of it, maitake, alba clamshell, brown clamshell, never heard of those either, and chanterelle. Now only averaging about half what rice is running. Just like some mushrooms have less arsenic than others, some rice has less. Rice grown in California has 40% less arsenic than rice grown in Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, and Texas. Why? Well, arsenic-based pesticides have been used more than a century on millions of acres of cotton fields. Noted to be a dangerous practice back in 1927, arsenic pesticides are now effectively banned. So it's not a matter of buying organic versus conventional rice, because millions of pounds of arsenic had already been laid down in the soil well before your rice was even planted. The rice industry is well aware of this. There's an arsenic toxicity disorder in rice called straighthead, where if you plant rice in soil too heavily contaminated with arsenic, it doesn't grow right. So instead of choosing cleaner cropland, they just developed arsenic-resistant strains. So now lots of arsenic can build up in rice without the plant getting hurt. Can the same be said, however, for the rice consumer? Same story with wine. Decade after decade of arsenic pesticide use, and even though they've been banned now, arsenic can still be sucked up from the soil, leading to the pervasive presence of arsenic in American wine, which could pose a potential health risk. Curiously, they sum up by saying chronic arsenic exposure is known to lower IQ in children, but if kids are drinking that much wine, arsenic toxicity is probably the least of their worries. When people hear arsenic, they think of it as an acute poison, and indeed a tiny amount, 100 milligrams, could kill you in an hour. That's like the weight of a tenth of a paperclip. But there's also chronic arsenic poisoning, where even a dose 10,000 times as small can be harmful if you're exposed day after day for years at a time. Chief among the concerns is cancer. Arsenic is classified as a Class 1 carcinogen. That's the highest level. Things known to cause cancer in humans, alongside stuff like asbestos, cigarette smoke, formaldehyde, plutonium, processed meat, consumption of bacon, ham, hot dogs, and lunch meat. So arsenic is pretty bad stuff, implicated in tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of cancer cases worldwide every year. Of course, cancer is just our number 2 killer. What about heart disease? Long-term exposure to low to moderate arsenic levels was also found associated with cardiovascular disease incidence and mortality, meaning heart attacks and strokes. Arsenic is also considered an immunotoxicant, meaning toxic to our immune system. How do we know that? Well, there's a virus called varicella, which is what causes chickenpox, the first time we get it. Our immune system is able to stamp it down, but not stamp it out. The virus retreats into our nerve cells, where it lies in wait for our immune function to dip. And when it does, the virus reemerges and causes a disease called shingles. We've all been exposed to the virus, but only about 1 in 3 of us will get shingles because our immune system is able to keep it at bay. But as we get older or immunosuppressed, the virus can slip its muzzle, like if you're given arsenic chemotherapy. Shingles is a common side effect because the arsenic drugs not only kill the cancer, but also some of your immune cells too. But that's at high doses. Might even low doses of arsenic, like the kind we're exposed to in our daily diet, impact our immune function? We didn't know until this study, in which thousands of Americans had the levels of arsenic in their urine tested, along with their level of antivirus antibodies, and indeed, the more arsenic they had flowing through their bodies, the lower their defenses. And if you're pregnant, arsenic can pass to your baby and may not just increase the risk of miscarriage and infant mortality, but may also affect an infant's immune development and susceptibility to infections early in life, but you don't know until you put it to the test. Infant infections in relation to prenatal arsenic exposure in a study out of New Hampshire, and indeed, the more arsenic the mom was exposed to during pregnancy, the higher risk of infection during infancy. Though it's unknown whether arsenic-induced changes in gene expression can impact the health of not only your children, but your grandchildren as well. Regardless, arsenic exposure isn't good for mom's own health, associated with increasing blood pressure. If arsenic suppresses immune system function, though, then at least maybe as a silver lining you get fewer allergies or something, which is kind of an overreaction to the immune system? Apparently not. Those with higher arsenic levels tend to have higher rates of food allergies, tend to not sleep as well, tend to not feel as well. If you ask people how they would rate their health, those reporting excellent or very good tended to have lower levels of arsenic, compared to those who just reported good, fair, or poor, they tended to have higher levels. What about diabetes? Here's 24 population studies on arsenic exposure and confirmed diabetes. Any result over 1 suggests increased risk for diabetes. Anything below 1 suggests lower risk. And here are the results, suggesting an association between ingested arsenic and diabetes. But population studies can't prove cause and effect. While it'd be nice to demonstrate a cause and effect relationship, is it necessary? Look, we know it's a carcinogen. We know it causes cancer. What more do we need to take steps to decrease our exposure? At some point during the reign of King Cotton, farmers in the south-central U.S. controlled boll weevils with arsenic-based pesticides, and residual arsenic still contaminates the soil. Now, different plants have different reactions to arsenic exposure. For example, tomatoes don't seem to accumulate much, but rice plants are really good at sucking it out of the ground, so much so that rice can be used for arsenic phytoremediation. I mean, you can plant rice on contaminated land as a way to clear it from the soil. Of course, then you're supposed to throw it and the arsenic away, but in the South, where 80% of U.S. rice is grown, we instead feed it to people. But national surveys have shown that most arsenic exposure has been measured coming from meat, poultry, and fish in our diet, rather than grains, but most of that is from the fish. So if seafood is contributing 90% of our arsenic exposure from food, then why are we even talking about the 4% from rice? Because the arsenic compounds in seafood are mainly organic, used here as a chemistry term, nothing to do with pesticides. And organic arsenic compounds, because of the way our body can more easily deal with them, have historically been viewed as relatively harmless. Now, recently there have been some questions about that assumption, but there's no question about the toxicity of inorganic arsenic, which you can get more of from rice. As you can see, rice contains more of the toxic inorganic arsenic than seafood, with one exception: hijiki, an edible seaweed, 100 times more contaminated than rice, leading some researchers to refer to it as the so-called edible seaweed. Governments have started to agree. In 2001, the Canadian government advised the public not to eat hijiki. Then the UK, the rest of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, then China advised the public not to eat hijiki and banned imports and sales of the stuff. Japan, where they actually have a hijiki industry, just advised moderation. What about Maine coast seaweed, domestic, commercially harvested seaweed from New England? We didn't know until now. Thankfully, only one type had significant levels of arsenic, a type of kelp, but it would take over a teaspoon to exceed the provisional daily limit for arsenic, and at that point you'd be exceeding the upper daily limit for iodine by like 3,000%, 10 times more than reported in this life-threatening case report attributed to a kelp supplement. So I'd recommend to avoid hijiki due to its excess arsenic content, and avoid kelp due to its excess iodine content. But all other seaweeds should be fine, as long as you don't eat them with too much rice. What does a number like this mean, though? 88.7 micrograms of inorganic arsenic per kilogram of raw white rice. I mean, that's only 88.7 parts per billion. That's like 88.7 drops of arsenic in an Olympic-sized swimming pool of rice. So how much cancer risk are we talking about? Well, just to put it in context, the usual level of acceptable risk for carcinogens is 1 extra cancer case per million. That's how we typically regulate cancer-causing substances. Whenever some industry wants to release some new chemical, we want them to show that it doesn't cause more than 1 in a million excess cancer cases. Now, we have 300 million people in this country, so that doesn't make the 300 extra people who get cancer feel any better, but you have to cut it off somewhere. OK, the problem with arsenic in rice is that the excess cancer risk associated with eating just about a half cup of cooked rice a day could be closer to 1 in 10,000. That's 100 times the acceptable cancer risk. The FDA has calculated that one serving a day of the most common rice, long-grain white, would cause not 1 in a million extra cancer cases, but 136 in a million. And that's just the cancer effects of arsenic. What about all the non-cancer effects? The FDA acknowledges that, in addition to cancer, the toxic arsenic found in rice has been associated with many non-cancer effects, including heart disease, diabetes, skin lesions, kidney disease, hypertension, and stroke. The only reason they just stuck to calculating the cancer risks is that assessing all the other risks would take a lot of time, and that would delay taking any needed action to protect the public's health from the risks of rice. Yes, physicians can help patients reduce their dietary arsenic exposure, but regulatory agencies, food producers, legislative bodies may have the most important roles in terms of public health scale changes. Arsenic content in U.S.-grown rice has been relatively constant throughout the last 30 years, which is a bad thing. Wherever arsenic concentration is elevated due to ongoing contamination, the ideal scenario is to stop the contamination at the source. Some toxic arsenic in foods is from natural contamination of the land, but soil contamination has also come from dumping arsenic-containing pesticides and the use of arsenic-based drugs in poultry production, and then spreading the arsenic-laced chicken manure on the land. Regardless of why southern rice paddies are so contaminated, maybe we shouldn't be growing rice in arsenic-contaminated soil. What does the rice industry have to say for itself? Well, they started a website called Arsenic Facts, no less. Always got to be skeptical of any group that claims facts in their title. Their main argument appears to be, look, arsenic is everywhere. We're all exposed to it every day. It's in most food. So what, we shouldn't try to cut down on the most concentrated sources? Isn't that saying, like, look, diesel exhaust is everywhere, so why not suck on a tailpipe? They quote some nutrition professors saying, look, all foods have a little bit, so eliminating arsenic would decrease your risk, but you'd die of starvation. That's like Philip Morris saying, look, the only way you're going to completely avoid secondhand smoke in your life is to never breathe, and then you'd asphyxiate, so might as well just start smoking yourself. If you can't avoid it, might as well consume the most toxic source you can find. That's the same tact the poultry industry took. Arsenic in chicken? No need to worry, because there's a little arsenic everywhere. See, so that's why it's okay that we fed our chickens arsenic-based drugs for 70 years. If you can't beat them, join them. Arsenic in rice is a cause for concern, according to a consensus statement of the European and North American Societies for Pediatric Nutrition. In the very least, wherever people eat a lot of rice, authorities should be prompted to declare which of the rice types have the lowest arsenic content and are therefore the least harmful for use during infancy and childhood. Extensive recent testing by the FDA found that long-grain white rice, which is what most people eat, appears to have more arsenic than medium or short-grain rice, but this may just be because most of the shorter grains are produced in California, which has significantly less contaminated rice paddies than those in the South, like Texas or Arkansas, where most of the long-grain rice is grown. So it's less long versus short than white versus brown. What about some of the naturally pigmented varieties like red rice or black rice, which may be even healthier than brown? They may have even less than white. That's exciting. One sample of black rice from China, purchased in Kuwait, had higher levels, but that's for total arsenic, so the toxic inorganic portion may only be half that, putting it on par with U.S. brown rice. Which makes how low this red rice sample from Sri Lanka even more extraordinary, but it had a ridiculous amount of cadmium, attributed to the cadmium content of widely used Sri Lankan fertilizers, evidently. Though colored rice samples purchased mostly in the U.S. were better than brown or white, a dozen samples of red rice purchased in Europe were as bad as brown or worse. I was hoping that wild rice would have little or none, since it's a totally different plant, but an average of 8 samples put it nearly comparable to white, though containing only about half as much toxic arsenic as brown. Yes, the arsenic found in a daily serving of white rice carries 100 times the acceptable cancer risk, 136 times to be exact, but brown rice is even riskier. Brown rice averages 2/3 more toxic arsenic than white rice. But is that just because brown rice tends to be a different strain or grown in different places? No. If you take the exact same batch of brown rice and measure the arsenic levels before and after polishing it to white, you do get a significant drop in arsenic content. But it's not what you eat, it's what you absorb. And the arsenic in brown rice appears less bioavailable than the arsenic in white rice. Maybe because the texture of brown rice cuts down on the release of arsenic from the grain, or maybe because the bran in brown rice helps bind it up. Regardless, instead of this, taking bioavailability into account, the difference may be more like this, a third more rather than 70% more. But this was based on an in vitro gastrointestinal fluid system, where they just strung together beakers and tubes to mimic our gut, like one flask with stomach acid, then another with intestinal juices. See, the problem is that it's never been tested in humans. Until now. Yes, brown rice may contain more arsenic than white rice, but how about just measuring the urine levels of arsenic in white rice eaters compared to brown rice eaters? That shows how much you actually absorbed. For the arsenic to get from the rice into your bladder, it has to be absorbed through your gut into your bloodstream. So if you test the urine of thousands of Americans who don't eat rice at all, they're still peeing out about 8 micrograms of toxic, carcinogenic arsenic a day. It's in the air, it's in the water, there's a little bit in nearly all foods. But eat just one food, a cup or more of white rice a day, and your exposure shoots up 65%. OK, but what about those who eat a cup or more a day of brown rice, which technically contains even more arsenic? Your exposure shoots up the same 65%. No difference between the urine arsenic levels of white rice eaters compared to brown rice eaters. Now, this was not an interventional study, where they feed people the same amount of rice to see what happened, which would have been ideal. This was a population study, so maybe the reason the levels are the same is that white rice eaters eat more rice than that of brown rice eaters, so that's why they ended up with the same levels. We don't know. But it should help to put the minds of brown rice eaters at rest. But would it be better to eat no rice at all? The arsenic found in 5 servings of rice a week poses 100 times the acceptable cancer risk. What does the rice industry have to say about that? When the story first broke that U.S. rice had some of the highest arsenic levels in the world, and all the headlines started, the USA Rice Federation said, "Enough nonsense about arsenic already." The study in their minds was not only inaccurate in the highest degree, but also maliciously untrue. To which one of the researchers replied, "Look, you're the one who's been ignoring the arsenic problem for decades. Had the problem of planting rice in arsenic pesticide-soaked former cotton fields been addressed, then safe soil could have been identified, low arsenic rice varieties developed, instead of just developing arsenic-resistant varieties so the plants can build up excessive levels of arsenic without dying themselves." Not all rice producers have been so head-in-the-sand dismissive, though. After a subsequent Consumer Reports expose, one rice company detailed how it was taking matters into its own hands. Lundberg Farms started testing hundreds of samples of its rice to share the results with the FDA. "We're committed to providing safe food," said the CEO, "and dealing with this problem very openly." They're not just sharing their results with the FDA, but with everyone. If you go to their website, you can see they apparently followed through on their testing promise. This is for their brown rice. Now, they use parts per million to make it look better than it is, but compared to the average U.S. brown rice level of 154, Lundberg does do better. In fact, their aromatic brown rice, presumably their brown basmati and brown jasmine, average less than national white rice levels. And so, apparently, does their red and black rice. In fact, none of those samples even reached the average U.S. brown rice level. Most other brands were pretty comparable. Uncle Ben's, for example, and Walmart, though Whole Foods scored the worst, about a third higher than these others and exceeding the national average. In the largest review to date, based on 5,800 rice samples from 25 countries, the highest total arsenic average came from the United States, with U.S. studies averaging overall about double that of rice out of Asia, with the high levels in the U.S. blamed on the heavy historic use of arsenic-based pesticides. But not all of the U.S. Yes, U.S. rice averages twice the arsenic of Asian rice. For example, nearly all rice samples tested in upstate New York imported from India or Pakistan had arsenic levels lower than 95% of domestically produced rice. But look at the range here. U.S.-produced rice went from here all the way up to here. Rice grown in the U.S. showed the widest overall range and the largest number of outliers, primarily due to where it was grown. There's significantly more arsenic in rice from Texas and Arkansas than rice from California. If you just look at California rice, then it's actually comparable to rice produced around the rest of the world. This is presumably some of the data that led Consumer Reports to suggest brown basmati from California, India, or Pakistan might be among the safer rice choices. If the arsenic is from pesticides, would organic rice have less than conventionally grown rice? No, which makes sense, because arsenic pesticides were banned like 30 years ago. It's just that 30,000 tons of arsenic chemicals already got dumped onto cotton fields in the southern states. So it's understandable why there's still lingering arsenic residues, even if you don't add an ounce of any new pesticides. That's why they specifically select for arsenic-resistant varieties of rice plants in the South. If only there were arsenic-resistant humans. Cooking rice in a high water-to-rice ratio reduces toxic arsenic content, meaning if you boil rice like pasta and then drain off the water at the end, you can drop arsenic levels in half. 50 to 60% of the arsenic gets poured down the drain, whereas the typical way we make rice, boiling the water off like in a rice cooker or pot, doesn't help. Or may even make things worse if the water you're using to cook the rice has arsenic in it too, a problem that exists for about 3 million Americans, as about 8% of public water supplies exceed the current legal arsenic limits. But cooking rice in excess water and then discarding efficiently reduces the amount of toxic arsenic in the cooked rice. Yeah, but how much nutrition are you pouring down the drain when you do that? We didn't know until now. Unpolished brown rice naturally contains nutrients that are lost when the bran layer and germ are removed to make white rice. To compensate, since the 1940s, white rice has had vitamins and minerals sprayed on it to quote-unquote enrich it. That's why cooking instructions for white rice specifically say don't rinse it and cook it in a minimal amount of water. In other words, the opposite of what you do to get rid of some of the arsenic. But brown rice has the nutrients inside, not just sprayed on. For example, rinsing white rice, like putting it in a colander under running water, removes much of the enriched vitamins sprayed onto the white rice surface during manufacture, removing most of the B vitamins, but has almost no effect on vitamins in whole grain brown rice because it's got the nutrition inside. Same thing with iron. Rinsing white rice reduces iron levels by like 3/4, but the iron in brown rice is actually in it, and so rinsing only reduces the iron concentration in brown rice by like 10%. But rinsing didn't seem to affect the arsenic levels, so why bother? Now, if you really wash the rice, like agitate the uncooked rice in water for 3 minutes and then rinse and repeat, you may be able to remove about 10% of the arsenic, and so this research team recommends washing as well as boiling in excess water, but I don't know if the 10% is worth the extra wash time. But the boiling like pasta and then draining the excess water really does cut way down on the arsenic, And while that also takes a whack on the nutrition in white rice, the nutrient loss in brown rice is significantly less, as it's not so much enriched as it is rich in nutrition in the first place. Cooking brown rice in large amounts of excess water reduces the toxic arsenic by almost 60%, and only reduces the iron content by 5%, but does reduce the vitamin content of brown rice by about half. Here it is graphically. A quick rinse of brown rice before you cook it doesn't lower arsenic levels, but boiling it instead of cooking to dry and draining off the excess water drops arsenic levels 40%. That was using like 6 parts water to 1 part rice. What if you use even more water, boiling at 10 to 1 water to rice? A 60% drop in arsenic levels. With white rice, you can rinse off a little arsenic, but after cooking you end up with similar final drops in arsenic content. But the iron gets wiped out in white rice by rinsing and cooking, whereas the iron in brown rice stays strong. Similar decrements in the B vitamins with cooking for brown and unrinsed white, but once you rinse white rice, they're mostly gone before they even make it into the pot. What about percolating rice? We know regular rice cooking doesn't help, but boiling, like pasta and draining, does. Steaming doesn't do much. But what about percolating rice as a radical rethink to optimize arsenic removal? So they tried like some mad scientist lab setup, but also just a regular off-the-shelf coffee percolator. But instead of putting coffee, they put rice, percolating 20 minutes for white, 30 for brown, and got about a 60% drop in arsenic levels using a 12 to 1 water to rice ratio. Here's where the arsenic levels started and ended up. The squares are the brown rice, circles are the white, so raw brown may start out double that of raw white, but after cooking with enough excess water and draining, they end up much closer. Though 60% percolating at a 12 to 1 ratio was about what we got boiling at just 10 to 1, so I see no reason to buy a percolator. But even with that 60%, what does that mean? By boiling and draining a daily serving of rice, we could cut excess cancer risk more than half, from like 165 times the acceptable cancer risk to only like 66 times the acceptable risk. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration has been monitoring the arsenic content in foods for decades. Yet despite the well-established science describing the health risks associated with arsenic exposure, no standards have been set limiting the amount of arsenic allowable in foods in the United States. In 2001, the EPA adopted a new stricter standard for arsenic in drinking water. In 2013, the FDA proposed a legal limit for apple juice, yet there are still no standards for arsenic in food, despite the fact that food sources are our main source of exposure. China has standards. As of 2014, China set a maximum threshold of 150 parts per billion, stricter than the World Health Organization limit of 200. In the U.S., a 200 limit wouldn't change the cancer risk much. Now at 150, if we had China's safety limits, that would help reduce cancer risk up to 23%, or even 47% at a limit of 100, but that could seriously affect the rice industry. In other words, U.S. rice is so contaminated with arsenic, if you set a safety standard that really cut down on cancer risk, it would wipe out the U.S. rice market. But with no limits, what's the incentive for the rice industry to change its practices? Setting arsenic limits would not only directly protect consumers, but also encourage the industry to stop planting rice paddies on arsenic-contaminated land. But those cancer estimates are based on arsenic-contaminated water studies. Maybe the arsenic in rice somehow has a different effect? You don't know until you put it to the test. Yes, rice has lots of toxic arsenic that urine studies show we absorb into our body, but to date there weren't any studies that demonstrated deleterious health impacts specifically of rice arsenic until this study. They figured, hey, arsenic causes bladder cancer, So let's just see what kind of DNA mutations the urine of rice eaters can have on human bladder cells growing in a petri dish. And indeed, they clearly demonstrated that those who eat lots of arsenic-contaminated rice every day can give rise to significant amounts of genetic damage, the kind that's associated with cancer. Yeah, but they used pretty contaminated rice. Only about 10% of the rice in certain parts of Asia might ever reach those levels, though a quarter in parts of Europe might, and over half in the US, making for considerable public health implications. So there remains little mystery surrounding the health risks associated with arsenic levels in rice. The remaining mystery is why long overdue standards for arsenic levels in rice have not been set in the United States. But that may be changing. Last year, the FDA proposed setting a limit on toxic arsenic, at least in infant rice cereal. Infants and children under 4 average the highest rice intake, in part because they eat like 3 times the amount of food in relation to their body size, so there's an especially urgent need for regulatory limits on toxic arsenic in baby food. Pediatric nutrition authorities have recommended that when it comes to rice and rice-based products, arsenic intake should be as low as possible. And hey, how about as early as possible? Approximately 90% of pregnant women eat rice, which may end up having adverse health effects on the baby. You can estimate how much rice the mom ate while pregnant by analyzing arsenic levels in infant toenail clippings. Specifically, an increase of a quarter cup of rice per day was associated with about a 17% increase in infant toenail arsenic, indicating that rice arsenic can be passed along to the fetus. What might that arsenic do? A quarter cup of rice worth of arsenic has been associated with things like low birth weight, increased respiratory infections, and above that, a 5 to 6 point reduction in IQ. So based on the FDA's findings, it would be prudent for pregnant women to consume a variety of foods, including varied grains, which is all code for cut down on rice. Saying eat less of anything, after all, is bad for business. Then once the baby is weaning, what's a parent to do? To reduce arsenic risks, Consumer Reports recommends that babies average no more than a serving of infant rice cereal a day, relying on other grains instead, which are much less contaminated. As the American Academy of Pediatrics has emphasized, there is no demonstrated benefit of rice cereal over other grains, such as oats and barley, all of which have lower arsenic levels than rice cereal. Reducing consumption of infant rice cereal to just 2 servings per week could have an even more dramatic effect on reducing risk. The proposed limit on toxic arsenic in infant rice cereals would end up removing about half off the shelves. The FDA recently analyzed more than 500 infant and toddler foods, and the highest levels of toxic arsenic were found in organic brown rice cereals and toddler puffs. Based on the wording, though I can't confirm it, they appear to be this brand. Not so happy baby if they suffer brain damage or grow up to get cancer. A single serving could expose infants to twice the tolerable arsenic intake set by the EPA for water. I contacted the Happy Baby company and was told that they were not able to provide any comments on the FDA's results. Eliminating all rice and rice products from the diets of infants and small children up to 6 years old could reduce the lifetime cancer risk, 6% lower chance of developing lung or bladder cancer later in life if infants stopped, 23% lower chance if young kids stopped. But switching to other grains is a move described as drastic and dramatic, creating a huge crisis for the rice industry, presumably, and therefore evidently not feasible at all. For kids and teens, the amount of arsenic flowing through their bodies was found to be about 15% higher for each quarter cup of daily rice consumption. A similar link was found in adults. A study of pregnant women found that about a half a cup a day of cooked rice could raise urine arsenic levels as much as drinking a liter of arsenic-contaminated water at the current upper federal safety limit. So that suggests that many Americans may be exposed to potentially harmful levels of arsenic through rice consumption. But you know where Americans get most of their rice arsenic from? Rice Krispies, though brown Rice Krispies may have twice as much. Organic brown rice syrup is used as a sweetener in organic food products as an alternative to high-fructose corn syrup. Big mistake, as organic brown rice syrup products may introduce significant concentrations of toxic arsenic into people's diets. For example, 2 of these might hit the provisional upper daily arsenic limit based on the water standards. Toddler formulas with added organic brown rice syrup have 20 times higher levels of toxic arsenic. And in older children, thanks to brown rice syrup, a few cereal bars a day could pose a quote-unquote very high cancer risk. What about rice milk? A consensus statement of both the European and North American Societies for Pediatric Nutrition recommend the avoidance of rice milk for infants and young children, and generally, toxic arsenic intake in infancy and childhood should be as low as possible. To this end, the UK has banned the consumption of rice milk for young children, a notion to which Consumer Reports concurred, recommending no servings a week of rice milk for children and no more than half a cup a day for adults. The arsenic in various brands of rice milk ranges all over the place, a 15-fold difference between the highest and lowest contamination, suggesting manufacturers could make low arsenic rice milk if they wanted. Consumer Reports found Pacific Brand and Rice Dream were right about average, though perhaps for Rice Dream it appears the vanilla or chocolate flavors may be lower. Rice vinegar doesn't seem to be anything to worry about, but rice pasta and rice cakes end up similar to pure rice, which makes sense because that's pretty much what they are. Though pasta is boiled, and so we'd expect the levels to be cut 40 to 60% like when you boil and drain rice. If for some reason you just couldn't live without rice milk, you could make your own using lower arsenic rice like brown basmati from India, Pakistan, or California, but then it may have even less nutrition, as at least most of the commercial brands are fortified. Better options might be soy, oat, hemp, or almond milk, though you don't want kids to be drinking too much almond milk. There have been a few case reports of little kids drinking like 4 cups a day, running into kidney stone problems due to the relatively high oxalate content, averaging about 5 times more than soy milk. How about 30 videos that touch on soy milk, how it may normalize development in girls and reduce breast cancer risk, as well as prostate cancer risk in men? Some of the latest science on soy milk includes an association with better knee X-rays, suggesting protection from osteoarthritis, and an interventional study suggesting improved gut health by boosting the growth of good bacteria. Though drinking 3 quarts a day, 10 to 12 cups a day for a year, may inflame your liver. 2 cups a day, though, can have an extraordinary effect on your cholesterol, a whopping 25% drop in bad cholesterol after just 21 days. An ounce and a half of almonds every day, like a handful a day, can drop LDL 13% in 6 weeks and reduce abdominal fat, though a cup of almond milk only contains about 10 almonds, less than a third of what was used in the study, so it's not clear if almond milk helps much. But there was a study on oat milk compared to rice milk. 5 weeks of oat milk lowered bad cholesterol, whereas rice milk didn't, and even increased triglycerides, and may even bump blood pressure a little bit. But the oat milk only dropped LDL about 5%, and that was with 3 cups a day. So as plant-based alternatives go, it appears soy milk wins the day. So why drink rice milk at all when there are such better options? There's really not much nutrition in rice milk. In fact, there are case reports of severe malnutrition in toddlers who centered their diets around rice milk due to multiple food allergies. Infants and toddlers have increased protein requirements compared to adults, and so if the bulk of some poor kid's diet is rice milk, coconut milk, potato milk, almond milk, they may not get enough. Oh yeah, show me one case of kwashiorkor, that bloated belly protein calorie deficiency due to rice milk. Here you go. Here's another one. Severe kwashiorkor, not in Ethiopia, but in Atlanta, Georgia, because literally 99% of his diet was rice milk. So these malnutrition cases were not because they drank rice milk, but rather because they drank rice milk nearly exclusively. But I just used these to illustrate the relative lack of nutrition in rice milk. So if you're going to choose a milk, might as well go for one that has less arsenic and more nutrition. Given the level of arsenic in rice, how could we figure out how much rice is too much? There are no U.S. standards for arsenic in rice, even though that's our main source of exposure. But look, there's limits on arsenic in apple juice and tap water, and so to calculate those, they must have sat down and figured out how much arsenic a day was too much, too risky, and then figured people drink, what, 4 to 8 cups of water a day, and set the limit that way, right? OK, well, can't we just use their how much arsenic a day is too much number, and based on the average arsenic content in rice, figure out how much rice a day is too much rice? Well, the allowable level established by the FDA for arsenic in bottled water, for example, is 10 parts per billion, assuming people might drink a liter a day. OK, so based on that 10-a-day limit, how much rice is that? Well, each 1 gram increase in rice intake was associated with a 1% increase in total arsenic in the urine, such that eating a little over a half a cup of cooked rice could be comparable to drinking a liter of that maximally contaminated water. Well, if you can eat a half cup a day, why does Consumer Reports suggest just a few servings a week? You could eat nearly a serving every day and still stay within the daily arsenic limits set for drinking water. Well, Consumer Reports felt the 10 parts per billion water standard was too lax, and so went with the most protective standard in the world, found in New Jersey. Isn't that cool? Good for New Jersey. OK, so if you use 5 instead of 10, you can see how they got down to their only a few servings of rice a week recommendation. Presumably that's based on average arsenic levels in rice, so if you choose a lower arsenic rice with only half the level, can you have 4 servings a day instead of 2? And if you boil rice like pasta, doesn't that cut levels in half too? So then you're up to like 8 servings a week. So based on the water standard, you could still apparently safely eat a serving of rice a day if you choose the right rice and cooked it right. And I would assume the water limit is ultra-conservative, right? I mean, since people are expected to drink water every day of their lives, whereas most people don't eat rice every day, 7 days a week. I assumed that, but I was wrong. It turns out the opposite is true. See, all this time I was assuming the current drinking guideline exposure would be safe, which in carcinogen terms is usually 1 in a million, as I mentioned before. That's how we typically regulate cancer-causing substances. Some chemical company wants to release some new chemical. We want them to show us that it doesn't cause more than 1 in a million excess cancer cases. Of course, we have 300 million people in this country, so that doesn't make the 300 extra families who have to deal with cancer feel any better, but that's just the kind of agreed-upon acceptable risk. The problem is, according to the National Research Council, with the current federal drinking water standard for arsenic of 10, we're not talking an excess cancer risk of 1 in a million people, but as high as 1 case in 300 people. What? My 300 extra cases of cancer just turned into 1 million more cases? 1 million more families dealing with a cancer diagnosis? This is 3,000 times higher than a commonly accepted cancer risk for an environmental carcinogen of 1 in a million. If we were to use the normally accepted 1 in a million odds of cancer risk, the water standard would have to be like 500 times lower, 0.2 instead of 10. Even the New Jersey standard is 250 times too high. It's a rather drastic difference, but underlies how little precaution is instilled in the current guidelines. OK, so wait, why isn't the water standard .02 instead? Because that would be nearly impossible. We just don't have the technology to really get arsenic levels in the water that low. The technologically feasible level has been estimated at 3. OK, so why is the limit 10 and not 3? The decision to use a threshold of 10 instead of 3 was mainly a budgetary decision. Otherwise, it would cost a lot of money. So the current water quote-unquote safety limit is more motivated by politics than by technology. Nobody wants to be told they have toxic tap water, and so they might demand better water treatment, and that could get expensive. As a result, many people drink water at levels very close to the current legal guideline, not aware that they are exposed to an increased risk of cancer. Even worse, millions of Americans drink water exceeding the legal limit. All these little red triangles. But even the people living in areas that meet the legal limit must understand that the current arsenic guidelines are only marginally protective. Maybe we should tell people that drink water, i.e. everyone, that the current arsenic regulations are really just a cost-benefit compromise, and that based on usual health risk models, the standards should be much lower. People must be made aware that the target should really be as close to 0 as possible, and that when it comes to water, at least we should aim for the reachable 3 limit. OK, but bottom line, what does this mean for rice? Well, first of all, so much for just trying to get rice down to the so-called safe water limit, since that already way exceeds standard carcinogen risks and is more based on feasibility and cost-benefit compromises, allowing for roughly a 500 times higher risk of cancer than is normally considered acceptable. So while authorities ponder when and how they will regulate arsenic concentrations in rice, maybe we should curtail or strongly limit our consumption of rice. Those who are exposed to the most arsenic in rice are those who are exposed to the most rice, like people who are eating plant-based or gluten-free, dairy-free. So at-risk populations are not just infants and pregnant women, but those who may tend to eat more rice. What a terrible irony for the health-conscious who are trying to avoid dairy, eat lots of whole foods, lots of brown rice. So much so, they may not only suffer some theoretical increased lifetime cancer risk, but actually suffer arsenic poisoning. For example, this poor woman, bad enough she had celiac disease, so had to avoid wheat, barley, and rye, but turned to so much rice, she ended up with sky-high arsenic levels and some typical symptoms: diarrhea, headache, insomnia, loss of appetite, abnormal taste, and impaired short-term memory and concentration. So we as doctors should keep an eye out for it in those who eat lots of rice day in and day out. In their 2012 Arsenic in Rice expose, Consumer Reports recommended adults eat no more than an average of 2 servings of rice a week, or 3 servings a week of rice cereal or rice pasta, though in their later analysis it looked like rice cereal and rice pasta had more, so dropped their recommendation down to only 2 servings a week. And that's if you're not getting arsenic from any other rice sources. So they came up with this kind of point system, so people could add up all their rice products for the week and make sure they're staying under 7 points a week on average. So if your only source of rice is just rice, then they recommend no more than 1 or 2 servings and then call it a week. But I recommend 21 servings of whole grains a week in my daily dozen. Well, get to know quinoa, or buckwheat, or millet, or oatmeal, or barley, or any of the other dozen or so common non-rice whole grains out there. They tend to have negligible levels of toxic arsenic. Rice accumulates 10 times more arsenic than other grains, which helps explain why the arsenic levels in urine samples from those who eat rice tend to be consistently higher than those who do not eat rice. The FDA recently tested a few dozen quinoa samples, and most had arsenic levels below the level of detection, or just trace amounts, including the red quinoas that are my family's favorite, which I was happy about, though there were still a few that were up around like half that of rice. But overall, quinoa averaged 10 times less arsenic than rice, the toxic arsenic. So instead of 2 servings a week, following the Consumer Reports recommendation, you could have 20. So that's strategy number one. Diversify the diet and consider alternatives to rice, especially for infants. Then we can minimize exposure, cooking rice like pasta with plenty of extra water. We found that 10-to-1 water to rice seemed best, though the data suggests the rinsing they recommend here doesn't seem to do much. We can avoid processed foods sweetened with brown rice syrup. Anything else we can do at the dining room table while waiting for federal agencies to establish some regulatory limits? What if you eat a lot of fiber-containing foods with your rice? Might that help bind up some of the arsenic? Apparently not. But the presence of fat did seem to have an effect, but in the wrong direction, increasing estimates of arsenic absorption, likely due to the extra bile we release when we eat fatty foods. We know that the tannic acid in coffee, and especially tea, can reduce iron absorption, which is why I recommend to not drink tea with meals. But hey, might it also decrease arsenic absorption? Yes, by perhaps 40+%, so they suggest tannic acid might help, but they used megadoses, 17 cups of tea worth, or that found in 34 cups of coffee, so isn't really practical. What do the experts suggest? Well, hey, arsenic levels are lower in rice from certain regions, like California and parts of India, so why don't we blend some of that in with some of the higher arsenic rice to even things out for everybody? What? Another wonky thinking outside the rice box idea involves an algae discovered in the hot springs of Yellowstone National Park, with an enzyme that can volatilize arsenic into a gas. Aha! So let's genetically engineer that gene into a rice plant, and they were able to get a little arsenic gas off the thing, but the rice industry is hesitant. Posed with a choice between genetically engineered rice and rice with arsenic in it, consumers may decide they just aren't going to eat any rice at all. Arsenic is not just considered a carcinogen, but a so-called non-threshold carcinogen, meaning that there really isn't a quote-unquote safe level of exposure. Any dose, no matter how small, may carry some cancer risk. So it may be reasonable to use the conservative ALARA approach, reducing exposure as low as reasonably achievable. I have a low bar for recommending people avoid foods that aren't particularly health-promoting in the first place, like when that acrylamide story broke, the chemical found concentrated in French fries and potato chips. I was like, look, we're not sure how bad this acrylamide stuff is, but we're talking about French fries and potato chips, which are not healthy anyway. So I had no problem provisionally bumping them from my list of yellow light foods into my red light list, from minimize consumption to ideally avoid on a day-to-day basis. One could apply the same logic here. Junk food made out of brown rice syrup, rice milk, and white rice are not just processed foods, but arsenic-contaminated processed foods, so may belong down here. But something like whole brown rice is more difficult, because there are pros to help outweigh the cons. The rice industry argues that the many health benefits of rice consumption outweigh any potential risk. That's the same thing you hear coming out of Japan about the arsenic-contaminated seaweed hijiki. Yeah, the cancer risk posed by hijiki consumption exceeds acceptable cancer risk levels by like an order of magnitude, but the Japanese Ministry of Health stresses the potential health benefits, lots of fiber and minerals, as if hijiki was the only weed in the sea. Why not choose any of the other seaweeds and get all the benefits without the arsenic? And the same thing here. The many health benefits of rice consumption outweigh any potential risk, as if brown rice was the only whole grain on the planet. Can't you get the whole grain benefits without the risks by eating oatmeal instead, or barley, or quinoa? Or is there some unique benefit to rice, such that we really should try to keep brown rice in our diet? Consumer Reports recommended moving rice to like here, not necessarily avoid it completely, but moderate one's intake. The rice industry criticized Consumer Reports for warning people about the arsenic levels in rice, saying there's a body of scientific evidence that establishes the nutritional benefits of rice consumption, and so any assessment of the arsenic levels in rice that fails to take this information into account is inherently flawed and very misleading. They cite two pieces of evidence. Rice-consuming cultures tend to be healthier, but is that because or despite their white rice consumption? What about how rice-eating Americans tend to be healthier? Yeah, but rice eaters also tend to eat significantly less saturated fat. So again, how do we know it's because or despite the white rice? They could have cited this study, showing brown rice intake at 2 or more servings a week was associated with a lower risk of diabetes. But presumably the reason they didn't is because white rice intake is associated with an increased risk of diabetes, and white rice represents 95% of the U.S. rice industry. Switching out a third of a serving of white rice a day for brown rice might lower diabetes risk 16%, but switching out that same white rice for whole grains in general, like oats or barley, might work even better. So other grains have like 10 times less arsenic and are associated with even lower disease risk. No wonder the rice industry didn't cite this study. They do cite the Adventist studies, though, and some in vitro data. For example, in a Petri dish, there are rice phytonutrients that can inhibit the growth of colon cancer cells at greater and greater doses, while apparently leaving normal colon cells alone. That's exciting. And indeed, those who happen to eat those phytonutrients in the form of brown rice once a week or more, between colonoscopies, had a 40% lower risk of developing polyps. The consumption of green leafy vegetables, dried fruit, and beans were also associated with lower polyp incidence. But the only reason we care about the development of polyps is that polyps can turn into cancer. But there had never been any studies on brown rice consumption in cancer until now. For all these years, warnings about the arsenic levels in U.S. rice potentially increasing cancer risk, but had never been put to the test until this study out of Harvard, and long-term consumption of total rice, white rice, or brown rice was not associated with risk of developing cancer in U.S. men and women. This was heralded as good news. No increased cancer risk found even among those eating 5 or more servings of rice a week. But wait a second. Brown rice is a whole grain, a whole plant food. Shouldn't brown rice be protective and not just neutral? If you look at whole grains in general, there's a significant inverse or protective association between whole grain intake in general and the risk of dying from cancer. Following my Daily Dozen recommendation of 3 servings of whole grains a day was associated with a 10% lower risk of dying from cancer, a 25% lower risk of dying from heart attacks or strokes, and a 17% lower risk of dying prematurely across the board. Whereas rice consumption in general was not associated with mortality, not found to be protective against heart disease or stroke, and so maybe this lack of protection means that the arsenic in rice is increasing disease risk, so much so that it's canceling out some of the benefits of whole grain brown rice. Consumer Reports suggested moderating one's intake of even brown rice, but given the arsenic problem, is there any reason we should go out of our way to retain rice in our diet? With all the other whole grain options out there, should we move all rice to here? Or are there some unique sort of benefits you can get from rice that would justify continuing to eat it, even though it has 10 times more arsenic than other grains? Well, there was this study that showed that a brown rice-based vegan diet beat out the conventional Diabetes Association diet, even after adjusting for the extra belly fat they lost, but that may have been due to the plant-based nature of their diet rather than just how brown rice-based it was. This study found a profound improvement in insulin levels after just 5 days eating brown rice compared to white. But was that just because the white made people worse? No, the brown rice improved things on its own, but this was in a South Indian population eating a lot of white rice in the first place, so this may have indeed been at least in part a substitution effect. This study showed that instructing people to eat about a cup of brown rice a day could significantly reduce weight and waste and blood pressure and inflammation, and not just because it was compared to white. But a larger, longer study failed to see much more than a blood pressure benefit, which was almost as impressive in the white rice group. So overall, not too much to write home about, but then this study rolled around. This is probably the single most important study on the pro-rice side, showing a significant improvement in artery function after 8 weeks of eating about a cup of brown rice every day, but not white. And sometimes even acutely, if you give someone a meal with saturated fat, you can get a drop in artery function within an hour of consumption if you have some obesity-related metabolic derangements. This was along with white rice, but if you give brown, artery function appears protected against the adverse effects of the meal. OK, so brown rice does show benefits in interventional studies. But the question was, does it show unique benefits? What about oatmeal instead, or whole wheat? Well, first they needed to design an artery-crippling meal, high in saturated fat. They went with a Haagen-Dazs coconut cream and egg milkshake, with or without a bowl of oatmeal, or instead of rolled oats, whole rolled wheat. What do you think happened? Do you think those other whole grains blocked the artery-damaging effects like the brown rice did? The whole oats worked, but the whole wheat did not, so one could argue that brown rice may have an edge over whole wheat. Do oats also have that beneficial long-term effect that brown rice did? The benefit was of a similar magnitude, but did not reach statistical significance. So bottom line, until we know more, my current thinking on the matter is, if you really like rice, you can moderate your risk by cutting down, choosing lower arsenic varieties, and cooking it in a way to lower exposure even further. But if you like other whole grains just as much, like if you simply don't care either way if you have rice versus quinoa or whatever, I'd choose the lower arsenic option. The spice saffron has traditionally been considered an aphrodisiac. It has been shown to improve Prozac-induced sexual dysfunction in women and men, significantly improving erectile function. If it works for drug-induced dysfunction, might it work for just regular erectile dysfunction? Why not just use pills like Viagra? They can work, but many men stop using them due to, for example, adverse side effects. Nearly half of men decide the cons outweigh the pros. For men that don't like drugs, there's always surgery, the implantation of penile prosthetics. Unbelievably, penile implant usage evidently dates back to the 16th century. Early experiments involved transplanting a guy's rib cartilage, or their actual rib, into their penis. Thankfully, space-age technologies in the 60s allowed men to keep their rib cages intact. Originally, the implants left men in a permanently erect state, but then the Flexorod was invented with a hinge in the middle, so the guy could bend it down in half for improved concealment. Of course, proper sizing is important. If the implants are too small, there can be drooping at the tip, leading to what's called a supersonic transport deformity. Why? Because its resemblance to the nose of the Concorde jet. Whereas over-long prostheses can also be a problem, with the semi-rigid rods eroding out of the penis. Although they generally perforate into the urethra, the rods can also extrude through the tip or the shaft. Ouch. Now there are inflatable devices, and perhaps one day there will be expandable foams that respond to external magnetic fields, or metal mesh technology that could expand and retract in a cage-like fashion. And you thought it was hard to get through airport security. Now there's got to be a better way. 20 men with erectile dysfunction were followed for 10 days, taking 200 milligrams of saffron a day. That's about a quarter teaspoon. But first they were brought into the Rigiscan room, where they were hooked up to a computer-controlled, battery-powered system for recording of penile tumescence, meaning swelling and rigidity. You can hook men up and have them watch a VHS videotape, though use of the device is controversial, described as an expensive, complicated, and time-consuming effort. But after the 10 days of taking saffron, they did appear to be a significant improvement in tip and base rigidity and tumescence. Whether it's possible to replace Viagra-type drugs with this golden plant will require further research with a bigger sample size. But it's not just size that matters. They didn't use a control, so this could have all just been one big placebo effect. Finally, though, a head-to-head challenge, saffron versus Viagra. Now, normally there's a third group, a placebo group as well, but evidently they felt it would be unethical to let men go 12 weeks without an effective treatment. The saffron appeared safer, significantly fewer side effects like severe headaches, hot flushes, nasal congestion, and nausea, but not effective at all. So that's why I never did a video on the subject. It just doesn't seem to help. But maybe it's because they made the mistake of taking the saffron orally as opposed to rubbing it on their penis. The effects of topical saffron on erectile dysfunction. About half of middle-aged men appear to suffer. So how about a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study? A gel containing 1% saffron, or, instead of saffron, a gel containing a little golden yellow food coloring so they looked the same, though presumably half the penises smelled like paella. I guess they didn't control for that. Both groups were trained to rub a pea-sized amount of the gel on their penis half an hour before sexual intercourse, and then were reassessed a month later. And compared to the food coloring gel, the saffron did lead to significant improvements in function and desire and overall satisfaction. They attribute the effects to a compound in saffron that evidently enhances nitric oxide production in the arteries, but if that's the case, then probably better to treat the cause and prevent the vascular dysfunction in the first place. We've known for nearly a half-century, according to 200 of the country's leading experts in cardiovascular diseases in a report representing 29 national medical organizations, including the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology, that coconut oil is one of the most potent agents for elevating the level of cholesterol in the blood. Studies showing coconut oil elevates cholesterol date back to 1955, when it was first shown experimentally that switching someone from coconut oil to something like soybean oil could drop cholesterol from like 200 down to 150. Coconut oil can significantly raise cholesterol levels within hours of consumption. A significantly increased blood cholesterol within hours of eating a slice of cake made from coconut oil, or from cod liver oil for that matter, but not from the same cake made from flaxseed oil. Coconut oil may even be worse than tallow or beef fat, but not as bad as butter. The latest interventional trial was published March 2017, a month-long randomized, controlled crossover study looking at the impact of 2 tablespoons a day of virgin coconut oil, and it elevated cholesterol about 14% over control, consistent with the other 7 interventional trials published to date in this 2016 review. But wait, saturated fats can make so-called good cholesterol, HDL, go up. So what's the problem? The problem is that doesn't seem to help. Having a high blood HDL level is no longer regarded as protective. What? But wait a second. Higher HDL is clearly associated with lower risk of heart disease. In fact, HDL levels are among the most consistent and robust predictors of cardiovascular disease risk. But see, there are 2 types of risk factors, causal and non-causal. Association does not mean causation, meaning that just because 2 things are tightly linked doesn't mean one causes the other. Let me give you an example. I bet that the number of ashtrays someone owns is an excellent predictor of lung cancer risk. I bet study after study would show that link, but that doesn't mean that if you intervene and lower the number of ashtrays, their lung cancer risk would drop, because it's not the ashtrays that were causing the cancer, it was the smoking. The ashtrays were just a marker of smoking, an indicator of smoking, as opposed to playing a causal role in the disease. So just like having a high number of running shoes and gym shorts might predict a lower risk of heart attack, having a high HDL predicts a lower risk of heart attack, but raising HDL, just like raising the number of gym shorts, wouldn't necessarily affect disease risk. How do you differentiate between causal and non-causal risk factors? You put it to the test. The reason we know LDL cholesterol really is bad is because people who are just born with genetically low LDL end up having a low risk of heart disease, and if you intervene and actively lower people's LDL through diet or drugs, their heart disease risk drops. Not so with HDL. People who live their whole lives with high HDL levels don't appear to have a lower risk of heart attack. And if you give people a drug that increases their HDL, it doesn't work. That's why we used to give people high-dose niacin to raise their HDL, but it's time to face the facts. The lack of benefit to raising HDL seriously undermines the concept of HDL being a causal risk factor. In simple terms, high HDL may not protect the heart. We should concentrate on lowering LDL. And so specifically, as this relates to coconut oil, the increase in HDL is of uncertain clinical significance, but the increase in LDL cholesterol you get from eating coconut oil would be expected to have an adverse effect on atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease risk. But what about the MCTs? Proponents of coconut oil, who lament that this whole coconut oil causes heart disease thing has created this bad image for their national exports, assert that the medium-chain triglycerides, the shorter saturated fats found in coconut oil, aren't as bad as the longer-chain saturated fats in meat and dairy. And what about that study that purported to show low rates of heart disease among Pacific Islanders who ate tons of coconuts? Studies of populations who eat a lot of coconuts are frequently cited by those who sell coconut oil as evidence that it does not have harmful effects. For example, there was an apparent absence of stroke and heart disease on the island of Kativa. What were they eating? Well, their diet centered around tubers, like sweet potatoes, with fruits, greens, nuts, corn, and beans. Yes, they ate fish a few times a week, but they were eating largely whole food, plant-based diets, so no wonder they may have had such low rates of artery disease. And one of those whole foods was coconut, not coconut oil. Now, if you go to Puka Puka, they eat even more coconuts, and there's even an island where that's most of what they eat. And they get high cholesterol. What's a population eating 87% plant-based, red meat, chicken, and eggs, only eaten seldomly, no dairy, doing with cholesterol levels over 200? Well, they're eating all these coconuts every day. What are their disease rates like? We don't know. There's no clinical surveys, no epidemiological data, no autopsies. They did do some EKGs, which can sometimes pick up evidence of past heart attacks, and found few abnormalities, but the sample was too small to be a definitive study. And even if they did have low disease rates, they weren't eating coconut oil, they were eating coconuts. Coconut oil proponents pointing to these studies is like the high-fructose corn syrup lobby pointing to studies of healthy populations who eat corn on the cob. Or the sugar industry pointing to studies on fruit consumption and saying, see, eat all the refined sugar you want. But fruit has fiber, and so do coconuts. Just like adding psyllium fiber, Metamucil, to coconut oil can help blunt the adverse effects on cholesterol, fiber derived from defatted coconut itself can reduce cholesterol levels as much as oat bran. And the plant protein in coconut, also missing from the oil, may also help explain why whole coconut may not have the same effects on cholesterol. Although coconut fat in the form of powdered coconut milk may not have the same effects on cholesterol as coconut oil, frequent consumption, defined as 3 or more times a week, has been associated with increased risk of vascular disease, stroke, and heart attack. And no wonder, as coconut milk may acutely impair artery function as badly as a sausage and egg McMuffin. They tested three different meals: a Western high-fat meal comprised of an egg McMuffin, sausage McMuffin, and 2 hash browns, versus a local high-fat meal. This was done in Singapore, so the more traditional high-fat meal was rice cooked with coconut milk, though there were also anchovies and an egg, versus the same amount of calories in an unhealthy low-fat meal comprised of Frosted Flakes, skim milk, and juice. Here's the artery function, the ability of the arteries to relax normally before Mickey D's and after, significantly crippling down artery function within hours of consumption, and the same thing with the coconut milk. So whether mostly meat and oil fat or coconut milk fat, the arteries similarly clamped down, whereas that horrible sugary breakfast had no bad effect on artery function, because, as terrible as it was, it had no saturated fat at all, though it also didn't have any egg, which may have also helped. Coconut oil proponents also try to argue that coconut oil has MCTs, medium-chain triglycerides, shorter-chain saturated fats that aren't as bad as the longer-chain saturated fats in meat and dairy. But you can't apply the MCT research to coconut oil. Why? MCT oil is composed of MCTs, the medium-chain fats, caprylic and capric acid, about 50% of each, whereas those MCTs make up only like 10% of the coconut oil. Most of coconut oil is the cholesterol-raising longer-chain saturated fats lauric and myristic. It is therefore inaccurate to consider coconut oil to contain predominantly MCTs, so you can't extrapolate from MCT studies to coconut oil. That's actually quite a common misconception, that the saturated fat in coconut oil is mainly MCTs. Actually, coconut oil is mainly lauric and myristic, which have potent LDL, bad cholesterol, raising effects. Coconut oil should therefore not be advised for people who should or want to reduce their risk of the #1 killer of U.S. men and women, heart disease. It's like how the beef industry loves to argue that beef fat contains stearic acid, a type of saturated fat that doesn't raise cholesterol. Yeah, but it also has palmitic and myristic that, like lauric, does raise cholesterol. If you compare the effects of different saturated fats, yes, stearic has a neutral effect on LDL, but palmitic, myristic, and lauric shoot it up. And frankly, so may MCT oil itself, bumping up LDL like 15% compared to control. So this popular belief, spread by the coconut oil industry, that coconut oil is healthy, is not supported by science. So basically, coconut oil should be treated no differently than animal sources of dietary saturated fat. The latest review, published March 2017 in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, put it even more simply in their recommendations for patients: avoid. Dr. Dean Ornish showed that a plant-based diet and lifestyle program could apparently reverse the progression of prostate cancer by making men's bloodstreams nearly 8 times better at suppressing cancer cell growth. But this was for early-stage, localized, watch-and-wait prostate cancer. What about for more advanced stage, life-threatening disease? There have been sporadic case reports in the literature suggestive of benefit. Men, for example, with extensive metastatic disease, given maybe 3 years to live, goes on a strict plant-based diet. 4 years later, it appears the cancer's disappeared. 6 years in, he gets a little cocky and backslides a little bit on the diet. Cancer comes raging back, and he dies. But that could have been a total coincidence. That's the problem with case reports, which are kind of glorified anecdotes. You have no idea how representative the outcome is unless it's formally studied. But throughout the 20th century, all we had were these kinds of case reports until 2001. So we had all this preliminary evidence, based on all the case reports, that prostate cancer may be sensitive to diet even after it metastasizes, may prolong survival, and even cause remission of bone metastases in men with advanced disease, so researchers decided to put it to the test in a 4-month-long intervention. They figured too much saturated fat, too little fiber, and too much meat may be the biggest players in tumor promotion and progression, so they put people on a whole-food, plant-based diet of whole grains, beans, seeds, and fruit. Figuring this would be quite the departure from their regular diet, they included a stress reduction component in hopes of improving dietary compliance. OK, so who were these 10 men? They all didn't just have prostate cancer, they all had underwent a radical prostatectomy to remove their primary tumor, and then subsequently had increasing PSA levels, indicative of probable metastatic disease. PSA stands for prostate-specific antigen. It's only made by prostate cells, and they just had their entire prostates removed, so the levels should be 0. The fact that they not only still had some PSA, but that it was rising, suggests that the surgery failed, and the cancer has spread and is making a comeback. Here's where they started out before the study began. This is a graph of the speed at which each of their PSAs was going up. So, if after 4 months of eating healthy the graph looked like this, it would mean the diet had no effect. The cancer would presumably still be powering away and spreading just as fast as before. Instead, this happened. In 2 men, it looks like the cancer accelerated, grew even faster. But in the other 8 men, the intervention appeared to work, apparently slowing down cancer growth. And in 3, it didn't just slow or stop, but appeared to reverse and shrink. Why the different responses? Well, in the Ornish study, the more people complied with the diet and lifestyle recommendations, the better they did. Dietary changes only work if you actually do them. Just because you tell people to start eating a whole food plant-based diet doesn't mean patients actually do it. One can use fiber intake as a proxy for dietary compliance, since all whole plant foods have fiber, and Ornish's patients about doubled their fiber intake from 31 to 59. How did this group do? They started out even worse, averaging 14 grams a day, and only made it up to 19 grams a day. That's not a whole food plant-based diet. That doesn't even make it up to the recommended minimum daily intake. If you look closely, only 4 men increased their fiber intake at all, so maybe that may explain the different responses. Like, how did patient 2 do? The man whose fiber improved the most had the best PSA result, and the man whose fiber intake dropped the most had the worst PSA result. Here's the graph. And indeed, it appears the more change they made to their diet, the better their results. The researchers concluded that a plant-based diet, delivered in the context of stress management, may slow the rate of tumor progression, and unlike other treatments, may give patients some control over their disease. And, as Ornish pointed out, the only side effects are beneficial ones. Dr. Ornish and colleagues were able to show an apparent reversal in the progression of early-stage localized prostate cancer with a plant-based diet and lifestyle program. And researchers at the University of Massachusetts and elsewhere showed a similar diet may help slow the progression of even advanced prostate cancer over a period of 4 months. How about 6 months? Researchers at UC San Diego found more cancer patients in the same situation and put them through the same protocol. These were patients who were already treated for invasive prostate cancer by either radical prostatectomy or radiation therapy, yet had rising PSA levels, suggesting the treatment didn't work and the cancer was on the move. In those with a cancer recurrence, PSA levels typically rise exponentially, reflecting the gradual inexorable growth of the cancer in the body. The rate of this PSA rise is the single best predictor of the development of overt metastatic disease, as well as of overall survival. The next step would be what's called hormonal therapy, which is chemical or surgical castration, which has a list of side effects, including loss of libido and sexual function and strength and vitality. Therefore, we try to hold off on that for as long as possible. So if we're just waiting, might as well give diet a try. So they were taught to increase intake of whole grains, vegetables, fruit, and beans, and to decrease meat, dairy, and refined carbs. Of all possible lifestyle interventions, why a whole food plant-based diet? Well, if you look around the world, there are huge differences in prostate cancer rates, with we're number one, USA rates up to 100 times higher than some places in Asia, for example. And it's not just genetic. Within one generation of coming to the U.S., cancer rates shoot up, and the grandkids end up with the same top-of-the-pile rates. A whole range of lifestyle factors have been looked at, but diet appears to have the greatest influence. Specifically, consumption of meat and dairy appears to increase risk, and consumption of plant foods appears to decrease risk, hence the plant-based diet. A possible mechanism is arachidonic acid, an inflammatory compound which we make from omega-6 rich oils like corn oil, sunflower, safflower, and cottonseed oil, and also comes preformed in animal-based foods, particularly from chicken in the American diet, and also eggs. And in a petri dish at least, arachidonic acid appears to stimulate prostate cancer cell growth as much as 200%. But ask men to remove processed and animal foods from their diet for 6 months, and what happens? This is the before. This is how fast their PSA levels were rising before starting the study. In the absence of treatment, levels of PSA tend to increase exponentially. But eating healthier, this happened. 9 of the 10 patients showed an apparent slowing of cancer growth, and 4 of the 9 an apparent reversal in cancer growth. The average doubling time, an estimate of how long it takes for their cancer to double in size, slowed from doubling every year to closer to every 10 years. There's been other studies using various diets and nutritional interventions like vitamin supplements, but none have worked as well as this one. And their compliance wasn't even all that great. They did good about boosting their whole grain consumption, especially in those first 3 months, but then backslid a bit. They did eat more vegetables, including a serving of greens and an extra serving of fruit, at least early on, and at least ate 1 whole serving of legumes a day when they started. So the researchers did observe some dietary recidivism by the end of the study. The patients started out stronger, but then started to slide back into old habits. So the researchers checked to see if maybe they were better able to beat off the disease during that earlier period. And indeed, at the end of 3 months, on average, there was PSA reversal. So changes in the rate of PSA rise were like opposite that of whole food plant intake, raising the provocative possibility that PSA may have been like tracking those changes, suggesting that the adoption of a plant-based diet may have therapeutic potential in the management of recurrent prostate cancer. Their findings suggest that without further surgery, radiation, or chemo, disease progression can be slowed or even reversed, despite the prevailing scientific consensus that cancer progression is largely irreversible. They're not refuting the benefits of standard therapies, and not guaranteeing that a plant-based diet and stress reduction will always induce remission, but the results do contribute to this growing medical literature that in at least some circumstances, cancer may be partly reversible. Just by modifying dietary and lifestyle factors, men may be able to prevent disease spread, all without getting their testicles chopped off. Lead toxicity remains a prevalent and major public health concern, especially for babies. And one of the most important sources of lead exposure for the fetus and infant is maternal blood. Lead in pregnant and nursing women's bloodstream readily crosses the placenta and into breast milk. Where does her lead come from? Most may originate from her own skeleton, where lead from past exposures builds up. Past exposures to what? Mostly through food, then dust, water, and air. One of the more atypical sources of childhood lead poisoning in the United States are lead-tainted candies, including, ironically, brands with names like Toxic Waste, though the FDA recall only evidently applied to the nuclear sludge variety, not the other toxic waste candies. Many of the tainted candies were imported from Mexico, particularly candies containing chili peppers and salt as major ingredients. Maybe the lead was from mine salt, or the grinding stones, or lead-containing pesticides, they're not sure. But wait a second, there's something else in grocery stores containing imported chilies and salt as major ingredients: hot sauce. In the last decade, the FDA has issued several warnings and recalls for food products that exceed the standards for lead. Products containing chili peppers and salt were often suspected as sources of lead contamination, such as the candies. However, products such as hot sauces that contain similar ingredients have not been the focus of evaluations, until now. They tested 25 different hot sauces, and about 9 out of 10 had detectable lead. But only 4 brands exceeded the FDA's action level of 0.1 parts per million. But that's the candy standard, so technically none of the hot sauces can be recalled off U.S. shelves. Although candy and hot sauce contain common ingredients, there's simply no hot sauce standard. The most contaminated hot sauces had about a microgram of lead per teaspoon, which may be more than young kids should be getting in their daily diet. But how many 6-year-olds are consuming hot sauce by the spoonful? Although hot sauce would not intuitively be counted among food products highly consumed by children, ethnic and cultural practices must be considered. Chili peppers and salt are commonly used in a variety of ways in everyday cuisine, and so they want to see the same stringent candy standard applied to hot sauce, or at least have some limit. Without enforceable standards for hot sauces, what motivation do manufacturers have to even look into the problem? For example, it may be the soil. The dirt is just so contaminated by lead that just washing off any residue on peppers after picking may cut lead levels 4-fold in the final product. But why bother taking the extra step if no one's checking? Any other imports we should be concerned about? I've talked about the heavy metal contamination of herbal supplements, but not this kind of herbal supplement. Several hundred people suffered lead poisoning, presumably resulting from the desire of drug dealers to maximize profits. Lead is heavy, about 50 times heavier than oregano, so is particularly useful for driving up profits. And it wasn't subtle. You could see the little lead particles. Why an epidemic of lead poisoning among young Pierce students? Because dealers could make an extra $1,500 per kilo. Baker's yeast and Crohn's disease. Can it kill you? Well, that's an inflammatory title, no pun intended. Crohn's disease is an inflammatory bowel disease. Might Baker's yeast, which is the same yeast as brewer's yeast, which is the same yeast as nutritional yeast, play a role in Crohn's disease? It all started with this study published in 1988, showing that people with Crohn's disease tend to have more antibodies to yeast than people without Crohn's disease. Antibodies are like homing devices our immune system makes to attack foreign invaders. That's one part of our immune system. Another is cell-mediated immunity, where our white blood cells attack invaders directly. And the same hypersensitive reaction to yeast was found in the white blood cells of Crohn's disease patients as well. If you draw blood from healthy people, even bakers who are around yeast all the time, and you expose their peripheral blood leukocytes, their immune system white blood cells, to yeast, nothing happens. They just kind of ignore it because it's typically harmless. But do the same thing with Crohn's disease patients, and their white blood cells go crazy. Now, when I say typically harmless, if you have cancer or AIDS or are immunocompromised, you could potentially get infected from home-brewed beer or probiotic yeast supplements, but they don't think the yeast is actually infecting Crohn's patients. People with Crohn's may just be hypersensitive to exposure to the inactive dead yeast in typical food products, which may help explain why when you rest their bowels, when you make Crohn's patients fast, they get better. In fact, that's why we add yeast extracts and proteins to vaccines as an adjuvant, an irritant like aluminum, to make the vaccines work better by heightening the immune response. But might that be raising the risk of autoimmune disease, boosting our immune response a little too much, especially in people who may be genetically susceptible, like with Crohn's? And the greater the anti-yeast response, the more severe the disease in both children and maybe adults too. So maybe we should try a yeast-free diet for Crohn's patients and see if they get better. But wait a second, just because anti-yeast antibodies are associated with Crohn's disease doesn't mean the reaction to yeast is causing the Crohn's disease. Maybe the Crohn's disease is causing the reaction to yeast. What? Think about it. Crohn's causes an inflamed, leaky gut. So maybe the Crohn's came first, allowing yeast particles to leak into the bloodstream, resulting in the anti-yeast reaction. So instead of the yeast reaction triggering the Crohn's, maybe the Crohn's just triggers the yeast reaction. Whether the antibodies are actually triggering inflammatory bowel disease or are only consequences of gut inflammation remained elusive. So how could we test it? Well, if anti-yeast antibodies are just a consequence of food particles leaking through the gut, Crohn's patients should have antibodies to all sorts of common foods. But no, higher anti-yeast antibodies in Crohn's disease compared to controls, but no greater reaction in Crohn's patients to milk, wheat, or egg proteins, which would presumably all leak through too. Or you can look at it the other way. Instead of other foods, what about other inflammatory bowel disorders? Ulcerative colitis or acute gastroenteritis? There you could get inflamed and leaky too, yet no increased yeast reaction. So there does appear to be something unique about the yeast-Crohn's relationship. But maybe inflamed Crohn's intestine just uniquely and selectively allow yeast through? If you cut out the Crohn's, can you stop the yeast reaction? Crohn's gets so bad that most patients have to eventually go under the knife and get sections of their intestines removed. So when the inflamed segments are removed, does the yeast reaction go away? No. No change post-op. So a change in Crohn's activity does not lead to a change in the yeast reaction, but we still have to prove that the yeast reaction comes first. Thankfully, the Israeli military systematically draws blood from their recruits, follows their health for years, so you can go back and check the blood of newly diagnosed Crohn's victims. And indeed, those who went on to have Crohn's were years earlier disproportionately reacting to yeast. So it's not like yeast reactions were low until Crohn's hit and then they shot up. Yeast reactivity crept up year after year before the diagnosis. Now look, it's possible that there was some subclinical gut leakiness in the years preceding diagnosis that led to the yeast reaction, but there doesn't appear to be any association between yeast reactivity and gut leakiness. So do high blood levels of anti-yeast antibodies result from a leakiness of the gut barrier in Crohn's disease? No, that does not appear to be the case. So if Crohn's isn't leading to the yeast reaction, does that mean that the yeast reaction is leading to the Crohn's? Anytime you have two things that appear to be associated, in this case reacting to yeast and Crohn's disease, they both can appear tied together because X causes Y, or because Y causes X. Well, in this case, it appears that Y does not cause X, but does that mean that X causes Y? Well, there's another option. Maybe there's a third factor that causes both of them independently. Maybe the only reason yeast reactivity and Crohn's disease appear to go together is that there's a third factor causing them both, like, for instance, Candida. Despite its extensive use in the brewing and baking industry, only about 5%, 1 in 20 healthy people have anti-yeast antibodies in their bloodstream, whereas in people with Crohn's disease, that number is more like 60 or 70%. Most people with Crohn's have antibodies that react to regular bakers, brewers, or nutritional yeast, which are all just different forms of a yeast known as Saccharomyces cerevisiae. But that Baker's Brewer's nutritional yeast had never been directly implicated in Crohn's. Maybe the antibodies are a direct reaction to it, or maybe a reaction to another yeast altogether, and the antibodies are just mistakenly cross-reacting with regular yeast. And indeed, 5 years later, it was discovered that antibodies against Candida, a totally different kind of yeast, the yeast that causes thrush and vaginal yeast infections, can cross-react with Saccharomyces. So maybe Baker's Brewer's nutritional yeast was just an innocent bystander all along. For nearly 30 years, we've known that antibodies to Saccharomyces are linked to Crohn's disease. But instead of bread, beer, and nooch leading to Crohn's disease, maybe Candida is causing the Crohn's disease and the antibodies. Or hey, maybe Candida is the innocent bystander, and exposure to food and beverage yeast is the real culprit. You don't know until you put it to the test. Take Crohn's patients, remove yeast from their diet, and see if they get better. If they do, then indeed it was the culprit, but if they don't, then maybe it was something like this, where Candida is the real cause. Before I get to the study, let me first just bust some Candida myths. Candida is a normal constituent of our gut flora. Get some Candida in your bloodstream, though, and it can cause a life-threatening infection. But it's normal to have some Candida hanging around in your mouth or colon. It's location, location, location. Just like having stool bacteria in our colon is normal, but stool bacteria in our blood or a wound would be bad. Because of the ability of Candida to cause problems in the wrong location, or in people who are immunocompromised, a Candida syndrome theory arose, linking the presence of Candida to all sorts of health problems, which led to mycophobia, fungal phobia, this false interpretation that the finding of Candida in your mouth or stool is evidence of some kind of infection, rather than just being totally normal. And if you think the authors are being a little overdramatic with their phobia talk, just Google Candida and you'll see. Not only is it normal to have Candida in your gut, you apparently couldn't get rid of it even if you wanted to. Give people powerful antifungal drugs and you can drop levels down, but they pop right back up again as soon as you stop them. And this whole concept of sugar feeds yeast, so go on a low-sugar diet, doesn't make much sense, since unless you're lactose intolerant or something, sugars should get absorbed high up in the small intestine and never make it down into the colon. And indeed, there appears to be no correlation between Candida counts and sugar consumption. You can put people on a high-sugar diet by adding an additional 14 spoonfuls of sugar to people's diets and still not see an effect. Of course, there's lots of reasons to cut sugar from your diet based on science, but Candida does not appear to be one of them. There does not appear to be good evidence that the so-called Candida syndrome exists at all. But oh, those are fighting words. Few illnesses have sparked as much hostility between the medical community and the believing lay public. The medical community has dismissed purported sufferers as emotionally disturbed, or just plain crazy. Of course, you can't just come out and call them crazy. Psychiatric diagnoses need to be presented gently. For example, some patients prefer to believe their mental illness is caused by the Candida, in which case doctors may just pat them on the head so they'll take their pills. Patients who self-diagnose with Candida apparently only infrequently relinquish their illness, some to the extent that they attempt to use their yeast as a drunk driving defense. I wasn't drinking, Your Honor. My yeast was just self-brewing beer in my gut. The whole concept of Candida syndrome is officially derided by the American Academy of Allergy and Immunology as speculative and unproven, offering no proof, no proof, no proof, no proof. The presumption that the ubiquitous Candida has some toxic effect on our system is without a trace of scientific proof. You want no proof, someone wrote in response. How about the millions of unnecessarily tonsillectomy surgeries doctors did? Don't get me started on the radical mastectomies. At least putting people on low-sugar diets isn't disfiguring people, though some anti-Candida therapies can be potentially dangerous. Antifungal drugs might breed resistance and can have side effects. Nystatin's not so bad, but ketoconazole can damage your liver. And indeed, there are reports of people being treated for what may be a fake diagnosis, ending up in quite dire straits because of it, so it's important to know if the syndrome actually exists. So researchers decided to put it to the test. Super simple study. Give some people some stool tubes to take samples, ask them a bunch of questions about the symptoms they have— headaches, stomach aches, tiredness, all the typical Candida syndrome symptoms— and they found no relationship to whether or not they had Candida growing in their gut, so no hints of Candida syndrome could be found. Thousands of years ago, some yeast floated down into our flour and drinks, and we were like, yummy, and we've been regularly exposed ever since. Not a problem for most people, but even non-disease-causing microbes could potentially trigger autoimmune diseases like Crohn's disease in people who are susceptible because their finely tuned immune balance is somehow off. Maybe that's why bakers have the highest Crohn's disease mortality, and from a different data set, among the highest rates of Crohn's disease. Perhaps a hypersensitivity to yeast may be playing a role in Crohn's disease. If you take people with Crohn's and remove from their diets the 3 foods to which they have the most antibodies to try to calm the disease, and then you add those foods back, you can provoke the symptoms back, re-stimulate the inflammation. So anal fistula off these foods, nice and dry, but then starts oozing again once the foods are back. But then the spigot's turned back off once the foods are removed again, to which I say, why is that doctor not wearing gloves? Anyway, without a control group, you can't exclude the possibility of a really powerful placebo effect. But there haven't been any such randomized control trials until now. A brilliant design. They tested people with Crohn's for antibodies to 16 different foods, and then randomized the people into 2 groups. Both groups were told to avoid 4 foods, but one group was told to avoid the 4 groups they most reacted to, and the other group told to avoid the foods they least reacted to. But it was all done with sealed envelopes, so no one knew who was in which group until the end. So, did it matter? Yes, more than twice the probability of major clinical improvement in the group that was told to stay away from the things their blood reacted to. But this wasn't just yeast. In fact, it was the exclusion of milk, pork, beef, and egg that was most strongly associated with clinical improvement, leading the researchers to suggest that, look, maybe instead of doing all the fancy blood tests, we should just tell our patients to cut out meat and eggs and see how they do, which would be consistent with both population studies that associate animal fat with an increased risk of inflammatory bowel diseases, as well as interventional studies showing that a plant-based diet, in which you cut meat down to like 1 serving every 2 weeks, can drop relapse rates as low as an extraordinary 8% over 2 years. OK, but what about the whole yeast question? Can't you just stick some yeast up someone's butt and see what happens? Why, yes. Yes, you can. They tested rectal exposure to 6 different foods in Crohn's disease patients, including yeast. Kind of like a skin prick test, but instead of pricking the skin, they pricked the inside of people's rectums with various foods. And you can see in this example the various prick sites: cabbage, milk, citrus, cereal, peanut, but whoa, yeast. Yeast gave the most significant reaction in Crohn's patients. So it appears that baker's yeast, which is the same yeast as brewer's yeast and nutritional yeast, may indeed have disease-causing importance in Crohn's disease. But the good news would then be, hey, it may have therapeutic relevance. Maybe if you put Crohn's disease on yeast-free diets, they'd feel better. You don't know, though, until you put it to the test. In fact, that's exactly what the original study linking yeast and Crohn's disease suggested back in 1988, a controlled trial of a yeast-free diet for Crohn's disease patients may be worthwhile. So why did it take years before such a study was done? Who's gonna fund it? Big soda bread? Thankfully, there are charities, like the National Association for Colitis and Crohn's Disease, willing to put up the dough, the yeast-free dough, that is. 19 patients with Crohn's disease ate their regular diet and then switched to a yeast exclusion diet, and there was a significantly higher CDAI, Crohn's Disease Activity Index, assessing symptoms like abdominal pain, diarrhea, during the period when they were eating yeast compared to the yeast-free period. So worse disease activity with yeast than without. Yeah, but what was this yeast-free diet? They didn't just cut out bread and beer, they switched people from dairy milk to soy milk, from white flour to whole wheat. Just cutting out milk can sometimes help with inflammatory bowel disease. So with so many dietary changes, how do we know what role the yeast played? This is how we know what role the yeast played. After placing them on the new yeast-free diet, they then challenged them with a placebo or a capsule of yeast, a tiny amount of yeast, like giving them a quarter teaspoon of nutritional yeast a day, and that made them worse, suggesting yeast may indeed be important in the disease process of Crohn's disease. Now, for the vast majority of people, yeast is not a problem, but in susceptible individuals, it may trigger an abnormal immune response in the gut. But wait, I thought it was that paratuberculosis bug that was considered a trigger for Crohn's disease. Well, hey, maybe infection with para-TB is what induces the hypersensitivity response to dietary yeast. Who knows? The bottom line is that people with Crohn's disease should not go out of their way to add bakers, brewers, or nutritional yeast to their diet. This landmark study suggested that exposure to dietary yeast, like baker's yeast, brewer's yeast, nutritional yeast, may worsen the course of Crohn's disease, an autoimmune inflammatory bowel disease. The reason they even thought to do the study was because Crohn's patients tended to have elevated levels of antibodies to yeast. But that's not the only autoimmune disease with increased yeast antibodies. The same has been found in lupus patients, and rheumatoid arthritis, another joint disease called ankylosing spondylitis, autoimmune liver disease, and autoimmune thyroid disease. So might avoiding yeast help those conditions too? They haven't been put to the test, but hidradenitis suppurativa has. What is that? Hidradenitis suppurativa can be a pretty gruesome disease. Starts out with just like pimples, though, typically along parts of the body where there are folds, armpits, groin, buttocks, under the breast. Then painful nodules form, which turn into abscesses and drain a thick, foul-smelling pus, and then it gets even worse, forming these active tunnels of pus inside your body. And it's not that rare. An estimated prevalence of 1 to 4%. That's like 1 in 50. Clothes typically cover it up, so it remains hidden, but you can often smell the pus oozing out of people. There are all sorts of surgical options and chemotherapy, but why did they even think to try diet for the condition? I mean, you can see Crohn's disease as a disease of intestinal inflammation. How a food you react to could make things worse. But why a disease of armpit inflammation? Because there seems to be a link between hidradenitis suppurativa and Crohn's disease. Having one may make you 5 times more likely to have the other. So there may be an immunopathogenic link between the two. They may share similar abnormal immune responses. So if cutting yeast out of Crohn's patients' diets help them, then maybe cutting out yeast might help with HS. A dozen patients with hidradenitis suppurativa put on a diet that eliminated foods with yeast, like bread and beer, and they all got better, 12 out of 12. Immediate stabilization of their clinical symptoms, and the skin lesions regressed, reversed, went away within a year on the diet. OK, but how do we know it was the yeast? By cutting out a food like pizza, you also may be cutting out a lot of dairy. And that's the one other thing that appears to help. A dairy-free diet led to improvement in 5 out of 6 patients. See, these tunnels of pus are caused by the rupture of the same kind of sebaceous glands that can cause regular acne, but in hidradenitis suppurativa they explode. And dairy products contain 3 things that drive the process of clogging up your pores and contributing to the leakage, rupture, and ultimate explosion. First, there's the casein, which elevates IGF-1. I've got probably a dozen videos on that. Then there's the whey and lactose, and third, the hormones in the milk itself. 6 hormones produced by the cow, her placenta and mammary glands, that end up in the milk. So why not try cutting out dairy and see if things improve? There's a whole series of nasty drugs you can try to beat back the inflammation, but as soon as you stop them, the disease can come roaring back. Even after extensive surgery, the disease comes back in like 25 to 50% of cases. So we are desperate to research new treatment options. But patients aren't waiting. They're getting together in online communities, sharing their trial and error through social media, and people reported successes cutting out dairy and refined carbs like white flour and sugar. So this dermatologist in New Hampshire was like, OK, let's give dairy-free a try. And 83% of his HS patients he tried it on started to get better, and he didn't even try cutting out the sugar and flour. Now, this wasn't a clinical trial or anything. He just figured, why not? It's not easy to do a randomized clinical dietary intervention, but that doesn't stop individual patients from giving things a try. I mean, you understand why there has to be institutional review boards and stuff when they try out new risky drugs and surgeries, but if it's just a matter of switching to soy milk or something, why do they have to wait? As patients search for an effective path to clearing this horrible disease, they need support and guidance to follow the most healthful diet available, free of dairy and highly processed sugar and flour. Nothing could be more natural. What about the yeast, though? How do we know it was the yeast? And look, 8 of the 12 patients just went through surgery, so maybe that was why they got so much better. It's like when I hear someone who has cancer and goes through the conventional chemosurgery radiation, followed by some quack clinic in Mexico, and then attributes their cure to the wheatgrass colonics or whatever they got. How do they know it wasn't the chemosurgery radiation that saved them? In this study, why do we suspect it was the yeast? Because not only did every single one of the patients get better, every single one showed an immediate recurrence of skin lesions following accidental or voluntary consumption of beer or other foods like bread. So not only did the elimination of yeast result in rapid stabilization and complete regression of the lesions within a year, but in every single case, take a little brewer's yeast or something, and within 24 to 48 hours, bam, symptoms are back. So that's why the researchers concluded that a simple exclusion diet could promote the resolution of the skin lesions involved in this disabling, and perhaps actually not so rare disease. What was the response in the medical community to this remarkable landmark study? Why was there no mention of informed consent and ethics committee approval? Letter after letter saying, wait a second, you violated the Declaration of Helsinki, which is like the Nuremberg Code or Geneva Convention to protect against involuntary human experimentation. Yet where was the Institutional Review Board approved for this yeast exclusion study? To which the researchers replied, look, we just told them to avoid a few foods. We gave them the choice. Look, we put you on drugs that can have side effects, cause liver problems, or you can try out this diet. And the patients preferred the diet. Not to mention, I would add, that they were all cured. Anyway, bottom line, by avoiding foods like pizza, which contains both dairy and yeast, sufferers may be able to prevent their armpit from turning into this, stage 3 of the disease. Eating choline and carnitine-rich foods, meat, eggs, and dairy, can be converted by gut flora into trimethylamine, which can then be turned into TMAO in our liver, a toxic compound which may increase our risk of heart failure, kidney failure, and atherosclerosis, heart attacks and strokes. The good news is, though, that this opens up exciting new nutritional and interventional prospects for prevention. OK, so how are we going to do it? If our gut bacteria can take meat, dairy, and eggs and turn it into TMAO, all we have to do is destroy our gut flora. We could give people antibiotics to eliminate the production of TMAO. However, that could also kill our good bacteria and facilitate the emergence of antibiotic-resistant strains. How about probiotic supplements? Maybe if we add good bacteria, we'll crowd out the ones that take the meat, egg, and dairy compounds and turn it into TMA, which our liver turns into TMAO. but it doesn't work. Adding good bacteria doesn't seem to get rid of the bad. What if we added a new bacteria that could somehow siphon off the TMA made by the bad bacteria? Well, there's a bacteria inside the guts of cows and sheep that turns trimethylamine into methane. So maybe we could use the bacteria to get rid of some of it from our gut, like a cow fecal transplant. The problem is, if it didn't take, you'd have to keep giving it to people. So maybe the fact that Consumer Reports found fecal contamination in every sample of beef they tested may be a good thing. No. Methane-producing bacteria may be able to eat up our TMAO, but unfortunately these bacteria may be associated with a variety of diseases from gum disease down to colorectal cancer. So, if antibiotics and probiotics aren't going to work to prevent gut bacteria from taking meat, dairy, and eggs and turning them into trimethylamine, which our liver makes TMAO out of, I guess we have no choice but to cut down on our liver function. That was the billion-dollar answer to cholesterol. These same foods raise our cholesterol, but dietary change isn't very profitable. So the drug industry came up with statin drugs that cripple the liver's enzyme that makes cholesterol. So hey, pharmacologic inhibition of the enzymes in our liver that make TMAO could potentially serve as a therapy for cardiovascular disease risk reduction. But there's a genetic condition in which this enzyme is naturally impaired called trimethylaminuria, in which there's a buildup of trimethylamine in the bloodstream. The problem is that trimethylamine is so stinky, it makes you smell like dead fish. So, given the known adverse effects from sufferers of this fish odor syndrome, the untoward odorous side effects make it a less attractive drug target. So, do we have to choose between smelling like dead fish or suffering from heart and kidney disease? If only there was some other way we could somehow stop this process from happening. Well, what do those with trimethylaminuria often do to cut down trimethylamine levels? They stop eating animal products. About a third of those who complain of really bad BO, despite good personal hygiene, test positive for the condition, but reducing or eliminating meat, egg, and dairy intake can be a real lifesaver. But given what we now know about how toxic the end product TMAO can be for normal people, cutting down on animal products may not just save the social lives of people with a rare genetic disorder, but help save everyone else's actual lives. The simplest point of intervention is to just limit the consumption of foods rich in choline and L-carnitine, which can be an effective strategy to limit circulating TMAO. But wait, we could always try to genetically engineer a bacteria that eats up trimethylamine. But the simplest, safest recommendation may just be to eat healthier. You can completely eliminate carnitine from the diet, since our body makes all we need. But choline is an essential nutrient, so we need some, and we can get all we need in fruits, vegetables, beans, and nuts. However, excess choline, such as that found in eggs, may be worth avoiding. Need we worry about high choline plant foods like broccoli? Cruciferous vegetable consumption is associated with a significantly longer life, less cardiovascular disease mortality. To see what was going on, researchers took the vegetable highest in choline, Brussels sprouts, and had people eat 2 cups a day for 3 weeks. And their TMAO levels actually went down. It turns out that Brussels sprouts appear to downregulate the TMAO liver enzyme naturally. Not enough to make you stinky, but just enough to drop TMAO. And people who eat completely plant-based may not make any TMAO at all. Even if you try, you can give a vegan a steak, which contains choline and carnitine, and not even a bump in TMAO, since vegetarians and vegans have different gut microbial communities. If we don't eat steak, then we don't foster the growth of steak-eating bacteria in our gut. So hey, forget the cow. How about getting a fecal transplant from a vegan? From a TMAO standpoint, maybe we don't have to eat like a vegan as long as we poop like one.